Right now here in 2018, if you want to build a new $450 gaming PC, you're most likely going to end up with integrated graphics from a Ryzen processor, and you're barely going to be able to hit 1080p in low settings on most games. That's not what we're doing today. Today we're putting together a $450 used gaming PC which can easily hit 1080p in high settings on even the tougher to run games. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome to Zach's Tech Turf. Today we're going to be taking a look at this $400 to $450 used gaming PC, which is perfect for someone that's looking to get a baller price to performance ratio. And if you're new here and you want to see even more PC building or PC gaming videos, then hit that subscribe button down below and also that notification bell. That way you never miss an episode. But yeah, let's start looking at this thing. Before jumping into the parts list, I just want to quickly mention that this build is a combination of some new and some used parts. Obviously, your mileage will vary when it comes to what kind of used deals you'll find in your area, but I feel like none of these deals are super crazy and it shouldn't be that hard to follow, at least if you're in the United States. We'll first start off with the processor, and this here is an Intel Xeon X3470, which is a monster 4-core 8-threaded CPU that boosts up to 3.6 GHz out of the box, and it only costs $30 off AliExpress right now. For just 30 bucks, it's pretty tough to beat 4 cores with hyper-threading at that high of clock speeds. This CPU also has some overclocking headroom if you spend a little bit more money on the motherboard, which I definitely didn't do, so I kept the clock speeds at stock. The cheaper motherboard that I went with is the Asus H55 model, which I picked up for $58, also off AliExpress, but there's a ton of options over there if you want to spend a little bit more money and get a P55, which would be way better for overclocking. With this H55 motherboard, my only overclocking options would be for a base clock, and that can get a little wanky sometimes, so just know that if you spend like $70 to $80 on the motherboard, you'll have way better overclocking options. Next up, we have the cooler for the X3470, and here I went with the legendary Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo, which I personally found new off Newegg for just 20 bucks. I don't think I really need to say anything more about this one. Everyone knows that this is a great budget air cooler. For the RAM, I actually found two separate 8GB kits of DDR3 for 20 bucks each, and that obviously totals out to 16GB for just 40 bucks. I've seen some mixed reactions about this kind of price online. In some countries, I guess you'll never find that kind of deal, but here in the States, I find that deal like every single day, so this might be the toughest part to find. Moving on to the graphics card, we're gonna go with this baller Asus Strix GTX 970, which I picked up used off the Mercari app for just $150. I actually just did a dedicated video about the 970 in 2018, so be sure to check that out because this is one of the best price to performance cards that you can get right now. Keep in mind that in light of the new Nvidia cards coming out very soon, you might be able to find an even better deal on something like a GTX 1060 if you get a little lucky. Moving on to some storage options, I'm actually pretty proud of these parts for a $450 build, as I went with this used 2TB Western Digital drive for just 30 bucks, and I also got this Kingston 120GB new SSD off Newegg for just 22 bucks. You guys know I always try to pack in an SSD for any build that can afford it, and for just $52 total, this build has both an SSD for the operating system and a massive amount of storage because of that 2TB drive, which is awesome. Getting to the end of the parts list, the power supply I went with is an EVGA 500W PSU, which I also found new off Newegg for 25 bucks, but you can obviously go with any 500 to 600W PSU that you can find a good deal on. This PSU is the main reason why I didn't overclock this system. You could probably get away with it, but you would be cutting it close. If you do want to overclock both the CPU and the GPU, I would recommend at least going with a 550 or a 600W power supply. And finally, the last main part of this build is the case to house all of these components, and I actually went with a brand new Corsair Spec 05, which I think I'm gonna do a separate video on because I'm really digging it. The Spec 05 is a very sleek black design with an acrylic side panel that has ample room for big GPUs and has a bunch of different options for housing a radiator. It did come with the single red LED fan, which probably isn't enough for adequate air cooling, and this is why I also added two of these RGB fans that I picked up on Amazon for 25 bucks. You can definitely go with any case fan for this, and I certainly wouldn't spend $25 like I did. These are just the RGB fans that I had laying around the studio. Now, before getting into the benchmarks, here's a final look of the build list with a total coming out to $425 if you don't include those RGB fans, or $450 if you do. Once again, these weren't crazy deals for my area, but if you're in a different country, this may be a little harder or easier to pull off. To kick off the benchmarks, I started with an easy to run game, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and in 1080p and high settings, this was obviously no match for this PC as we averaged a solid 182 FPS. Keep in mind that super low 0.1% low is most likely due to this older 2TB hard drive, so if you get lucky and find a better deal on a hard drive than I did, you probably won't have this issue. Next up was everyone but me's favorite game, Fortnite, and here also in 1080p and high settings, I got a very solid average of 106 FPS. If you were to use the standard pro settings, which is something like no shadows, high textures, and a few other things, you would easily be able to maintain above that target 144 FPS average if you wanted to. Moving on, I finally added Rainbow Six Siege to the benchmarking run after a huge amount of requests from you guys, and here in 1080p and high settings, this build could crank out an average of 133 FPS. This was in fact using the built-in benchmarking tool, and I haven't played a second of this game, so I'm not quite sure how this average translates to actual online gameplay, but it's probably pretty close. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds was up next. This one will really test out our Xeon processor because this is a heavy CPU demanding title, and once again in 1080p high settings, we averaged 85 FPS. Getting into the harder to run games, I tested out Far Cry 5, which is pretty much the crisis test in 2018 at this point, and in 1080p normal settings, aka medium, this PC could average just above that target 60 FPS mark. At high settings, it was around the high 40s and low 50s, which is certainly playable, but you guys know I'm always chasing that 60 FPS mark. And finally, the last game in my benchmarking run was Monster Hunter World, which I actually did a full benchmarking video on with budget graphics cards, and here in 1080p medium settings, I averaged just under that 60 FPS mark. This game is surely a tough game to run, but it was still a very smooth playing experience. Well, there you have it. That wraps up my $450 used gaming PC build for here in 2018, and as you can see from the benchmarks, this PC can handle any game on the market with at least 1080p to medium to high settings, which is pretty impressive if you ask me. Now feel free to head on over to one of these two videos if you haven't seen them yet, and definitely hit that subscribe button because in the next video, we're talking about a very different way to cool your next gaming PC. You don't want to miss that video.